Deep beneath the endless sands of the Arabian Peninsula lies a secret that has haunted explorers for over 1,000 years. A city so magnificent, so wealthy, that its very existence was dismissed as nothing more than desert legend. But what if I told you that this lost metropolis, this Arabian Atlantis, was not only real, but that we've actually found it? In 1992, a team of archaeologists, using declassified spy satellite images from the Cold War, stumbled upon something extraordinary in the Rub al Khali desert. Something that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient Arabia. What they discovered wasn't just ruins. It was evidence of a civilization so advanced, so mysteriously vanished, that it challenges our entire understanding of the ancient world. Tonight, we're going deep into one of archaeology's most controversial discoveries, because the story of Ubar isn't just about finding a lost city. It's about uncovering a truth so profound that some believe it threatens the very foundations of Middle Eastern history. And by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why certain institutions have remained mysteriously silent about what was really found beneath those desert sands. The legend begins in the 7th century, when the Quran first spoke of a people who defied divine warning. They were called the people of Ad, and they built a city unlike any other on earth. Iram of the Pillars, it was called, a place of such architectural wonder that it had no equal in any land. But their pride became their downfall. According to the text, they were destroyed in a single night by a howling wind that lasted 8 days and 7 nights, burying their magnificent city beneath the sands forever. For over 13 centuries, scholars debated whether this city ever existed at all. Was it merely an allegory, a moral tale wrapped in metaphor? Or did the desert truly swallow a real metropolis, leaving behind only whispers and legends? The ancient Greeks knew of this place too, but they called it by a different name. To them, it was the source of frankincense, that precious resin more valuable than gold in the ancient world. Ptolemy marked it on his maps as a trading post along the legendary incense route. But even the Greeks spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the very act of naming it might summon some ancient curse. Medieval Arab geographers were more specific. They described Ubar as a city of immense wealth, built around natural springs that turned the surrounding desert into a paradise. Caravans would travel for months across the harshest terrain on earth just to reach its gates. The city controlled the frankincense trade, and with it held economic power over the entire ancient world. Because frankincense wasn't just incense, it was medicine, currency, and the key to communicating with the divine. Every temple from Rome to Jerusalem burned with the smoke of Ubar's treasure. But then, sometime between the 4th and 6th centuries CE, the city simply vanished. Trade routes shifted, the springs dried up, the desert reclaimed what it had given, and Ubar faded from history into legend, becoming nothing more than a story told around desert campfires. By the 20th century, most archaeologists had written it off entirely. After all, how do you find a city that might never have existed in a desert that spans over 250,000 square miles? It would be like searching for a specific grain of sand in an ocean of identical dunes. That's when fate and Cold War technology intervened in the most unexpected way. The year was 1981, and documentary filmmaker Nicholas Clapp was researching ancient trade routes when he stumbled across something that would change everything. In the archives of the Huntington Library in California, he discovered a map drawn by the legendary Arabian explorer Bertram Thomas. Thomas had crossed the empty quarter in 1930, and his map showed something extraordinary. Ancient caravan tracks, barely visible from ground level, converging on a single point deep in the desert. The Bedouins who guided Thomas had called this place Ubar. But here's where the story gets interesting. Clapp realized that these ancient tracks, worn into the bedrock by thousands of years of camel caravans, might be visible from space. And in the 1982nd, there was only one organization with the technology to see the Earth from that perspective: NASA. What happened next reads like something from a spy thriller. Clapp approached NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory with a proposal that seemed impossible. Could space-age technology locate a city that existed only in legend? The scientists were intrigued. They had access to something that had never been used for archaeology before: declassified images from military spy satellites taken during the height of the Cold War. These weren't ordinary photographs. The satellites had used radar and infrared imaging to peer through sand and cloud cover, mapping the Earth for strategic purposes. And when the NASA team processed these images of the Arabian Peninsula, they saw something that made them question everything they thought they knew about the empty quarter. The ancient trade routes were there, exactly as Bertram Thomas had mapped them 60 years earlier. But the satellite images revealed something Thomas could never have seen from ground level. The tracks didn't just converge randomly. They formed a perfect web, like spokes on a wheel, all leading to a single focal point in the heart of the Rub al Khali desert. And at that focal point, buried beneath centuries of sand, the instruments detected something that shouldn't exist: the geometric outlines of structures. Massive structures. Dr. Ronald Blom, the NASA scientist leading the project, would later say that what they found challenged every assumption about ancient Arabian civilization. The images showed evidence of a settlement far larger and more sophisticated than anything previously known to exist in that region during the proposed timeframe. But seeing something from space and proving it on the ground are two entirely different challenges. The site was located in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, in a region where summer temperatures exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit and where getting lost means certain death. It would take a full archaeological expedition to confirm what the satellites had glimpsed from orbit. In 1990, that expedition finally happened. Led by archaeologist Dr. Juris Zarins from Missouri State University, the team included some of the most experienced desert researchers in the world. They knew they were looking for something extraordinary, but nothing could have prepared them for what they actually found. The coordinates led them to a place the local Bedouins called Shiz, a lonely outpost marked by a single well and the ruins of what appeared to be a medieval fort. For most people, it would have seemed like nothing more than another forgotten way station along an ancient trade route, but the archaeologists saw something different. As they began to excavate, the true scale of the site became apparent. The medieval fort wasn't built on empty ground. It was constructed directly on top of something much older, much larger. Layer by layer, they peeled back thousands of years of history, and what emerged from the sand defied every expectation. The structure they uncovered wasn't just a city. It was a fortress city, with walls thick enough to withstand siege warfare and sophisticated enough to suggest a level of engineering that archaeologists hadn't expected to find in ancient Arabia. The layout was complex, with multiple chambers, defensive positions, and most remarkably, evidence of an advanced water management system. But the real revelation came when they reached the oldest layers of the site. Here, they found pottery fragments that told a story spanning over 4,000 years of continuous occupation. This wasn't just some medieval trading post that had been abandoned and forgotten. This was a site that had been occupied, rebuilt, and reoccupied across millennia, serving as a crucial hub in the ancient world's most important trade network. The pottery styles revealed connections that stunned the archaeological community. They found fragments that matched ceramics from Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, even ancient Egypt. This remote desert outpost had been in contact with civilizations thousands of miles away, serving as a crucial link in a trade network that spanned the known world. And then came the discovery that changed everything. In the deepest, oldest layers of the excavation, they found something that seemed to confirm the most extraordinary claims of the ancient texts. Evidence of a catastrophic collapse. Not the gradual abandonment you might expect from a changing economy or shifting trade routes, but sudden, violent destruction. The geological evidence told a story that aligned perfectly with the ancient accounts. The site was built over a natural limestone cavern, a formation that would have created the springs described in the medieval accounts. But limestone is unstable. Over time, the constant flow of water would have weakened the bedrock, creating a geological time bomb. The evidence suggested that sometime in the distant past, the cavern had collapsed catastrophically, swallowing much of the ancient city and cutting off the water supply that had made the location habitable. It was a natural disaster that would have seemed like divine intervention to anyone who witnessed it. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. As news of the discovery spread through academic circles, something strange began to happen. The initial excitement gave way to caution, then to something approaching silence. Major archaeological journals that should have been eager to publish groundbreaking findings seemed reluctant to engage with the implications of what had been found. The reason for this hesitation becomes clear when you consider what the discovery really meant. If Ubar was real, if the archaeological evidence matched the ancient accounts so precisely, then it raised uncomfortable questions about how we interpret other ancient texts. How many other mythical cities might be waiting beneath the sand? How many legends dismissed as folklore might actually be historical records? And that's just the beginning of the mystery. Because what the team found at Shiza was extraordinary, but it was also incomplete. The satellite images had revealed a site much larger than what they'd excavated. Most of the ancient city remained buried, protected by the same sands that had hidden it for centuries. The question that haunts researchers today is simple. What else is down there? What other secrets lie buried in the deeper layers that haven't been excavated? And perhaps more importantly, why has there been so little follow-up research at a site that represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era? The answers to these questions lead us into territory that some find uncomfortable, territory that challenges not just our understanding of ancient Arabia, but our assumptions about how advanced pre-Islamic civilizations really were. Because the more we learn about Ubar, the more it becomes clear that this wasn't just a trading post or a desert way station. This was something much more significant, something that forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. The implications of what was discovered at Shiza go far beyond simply finding an ancient city. When you piece together all the evidence, a picture emerges that challenges fundamental assumptions about Arabian civilization. And here's what makes it even more intriguing. The sophistication of what they found doesn't match what we've been taught about pre-Islamic Arabia. Traditional historical narratives paint ancient Arabia as a collection of nomadic tribes, surviving on the margins of the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But the evidence from Ubar suggests something entirely different. This was a civilization capable of engineering projects that rivaled anything built in the ancient world. The water management system alone required knowledge of hydrology and geology that we didn't think existed in that region at that time. Dr. Zarins made an observation that sent ripples through the archaeological community. The construction techniques found at the deepest levels of the site were more advanced than those found in the upper layers. This suggests that rather than progressing over time, the civilization at Ubar actually declined. The oldest structures showed the highest level of sophistication, as if the builders possessed knowledge that was later lost. This pattern is disturbing because it contradicts our basic understanding of how civilizations develop. We expect to see progression, advancement, increasing complexity over time. But at Ubar, the evidence suggests the opposite. The earliest inhabitants possessed capabilities that their descendants couldn't match. It's as if some crucial knowledge had been deliberately forgotten or violently interrupted. The artifact analysis revealed even more puzzling details. Among the pottery fragments and tools, researchers found objects that seemed anachronistic, pieces of worked metal showing techniques that weren't supposed to exist in Arabia until much later periods. Glass beads of a quality that required furnaces capable of reaching temperatures that the local technology shouldn't have been able to achieve. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery was what they didn't find. In a trading center that allegedly controlled the frankincense route for centuries, there was remarkably little frankincense residue. The storage areas that should have contained evidence of the precious resin were largely empty. It was as if the city's most valuable commodity had been systematically removed before the final abandonment. This absence raises questions that researchers have been reluctant to address publicly. Was the frankincense trade merely a cover for something else? Were the caravans that converged on Ubar carrying more than just aromatic resin? The ancient texts speak of knowledge being traded along these routes, of wisdom that flowed from east to west along with the commercial goods. Some scholars have begun to whisper about a possibility that makes academic institutions uncomfortable. What if Ubar wasn't just a trading center? What if it was a repository of knowledge, a place where ancient wisdom was collected, preserved, and disseminated? The library at Alexandria gets all the attention, but what if there were other centers of learning, other collections of human knowledge that have been erased from the historical record? The architectural evidence supports this theory in disturbing ways. Hidden within the fortress walls, the excavation team found chambers that served no obvious commercial or defensive purpose. These rooms were positioned to receive optimal natural light during specific times of day, suggesting they were designed for detailed work. Reading, writing, study. Carbon dating of organic materials found in these chambers revealed something that didn't make sense. The dates clustered around very specific time periods, suggesting intense activity followed by sudden abandonment. And those dates align with some of the most turbulent periods in ancient Middle Eastern history. Times when knowledge was being systematically destroyed, when libraries were burned, and scholars were scattered to the winds. The pattern becomes even more suspicious when you look at what happened to similar sites throughout the region. Archaeological evidence suggests that dozens of ancient settlements along the incense routes were abandoned around the same time periods. Not gradually, as you'd expect from economic decline, but suddenly, as if some coordinated effort had swept through the region, erasing centers of learning and commerce alike. Modern satellite archaeology has identified the remains of these abandoned settlements scattered across the Arabian Peninsula. Most remain unexcavated, buried beneath sand and time. But the few that have been explored show the same pattern as Ubar. Sudden abandonment, evidence of hasty evacuation, and a conspicuous absence of the materials you'd expect to find in ancient libraries or schools. This systematic erasure suggests something more deliberate than natural disaster or economic collapse. It points to organized destruction, to a conscious effort to eliminate not just cities, but the knowledge they contained. And if that's true, then Ubar represents more than just an archaeological discovery. It represents evidence of one of history's most successful cover-ups. The silence surrounding Ubar becomes more understandable when viewed through this lens. If the site contains evidence of advanced knowledge that predates accepted chronologies, if it proves that ancient Arabian civilization was more sophisticated than we've been taught, then it threatens established historical narratives. And established narratives have powerful protectors. Consider the funding sources for Middle Eastern archaeology. Much of it comes from institutions with vested interests in maintaining specific interpretations of regional history. Universities dependent on donations from governments and religious organizations. Museums whose collections and reputations are built on particular versions of the past. Research foundations with political agendas that extend far beyond academic curiosity. When a discovery threatens these established interests, the response is predictable. Not outright denial, which would be too obvious, but subtle discouragement. Funding becomes harder to obtain. Publication opportunities dry up. Researchers find themselves gently steered toward less controversial projects. And slowly, quietly, the inconvenient discovery fades from academic discourse. This explains why, despite the significance of the Ubar discovery, there have been no major follow-up expeditions. Why the site remains largely unexcavated, despite clear evidence that much more lies buried beneath the sand. Why the most detailed analyses of the findings remain unpublished in major journals. The discovery is too important to ignore completely, but too dangerous to pursue aggressively. But the evidence that has emerged tells a story that's impossible to suppress entirely. The pottery analysis revealed trade connections that spanned continents. Chemical analysis of metal artifacts showed alloys that required knowledge of metallurgy, supposedly unknown in ancient Arabia. Geological surveys confirmed the presence of additional structures, possibly even more significant than what's already been uncovered. And then there are the inscriptions. Carved into stone foundations and etched into pottery fragments, researchers found symbols and text that don't fit neatly into established linguistic categories. Some appear to be early Arabic script, but others resist classification entirely. They show influences from multiple writing systems, suggesting a cosmopolitan environment where knowledge from different cultures was collected and synthesized. The implications are staggering. If Ubar was indeed a center where ancient knowledge was preserved and transmitted, then its destruction represents one of the greatest losses in human history. Not just the loss of a city, but the loss of accumulated wisdom that might have changed the course of human development. But here's what's most disturbing about the whole situation. The technology exists to uncover the rest of Ubar. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced excavation techniques, sophisticated dating methods. We have the tools to answer the questions that the initial discovery raised. And yet, 30 years after the site was first identified, most of it remains buried and unstudied. The question becomes unavoidable. Who benefits from keeping Ubar's secrets buried? Who has the power to ensure that one of archaeology's most significant discoveries remains largely unexplored? And what are they afraid we might find if we keep digging? The answer to these questions takes us into territory that makes academic institutions nervous. Territory where archaeology intersects with politics, where ancient history becomes modern controversy, where the search for truth runs up against forces that prefer certain truths to remain hidden. Because the story of Ubar isn't just about the past. It's about who controls our understanding of the past, and why that control matters more than most people realize. The evidence that's been systematically overlooked tells a story that challenges everything we've been taught about the flow of knowledge in the ancient world. When researchers examined the astronomical alignments of Ubar's structures, they discovered something that should have sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. The buildings weren't just randomly positioned. They were aligned with celestial events with a precision that suggests mathematical knowledge far beyond what we associate with ancient Arabian culture. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. The alignments don't just correspond to local astronomical phenomena. They track celestial events that would have been visible from multiple locations across the ancient world. Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, even ancient China. It's as if the builders of Ubar were part of a global network of astronomers, sharing observations and calculations across vast distances. This astronomical sophistication shows up in ways that make traditional archaeologists uncomfortable. The orientation of the main structures creates sight lines that would have allowed precise observation of planetary movements. The spacing between buildings follows mathematical ratios that wouldn't be formally recognized by Western mathematics for another 1,000 years. And most disturbing of all, the entire complex seems designed as a massive calculating device, a stone computer for tracking celestial cycles. Dr. Sarah Chen, an archaeoastronomer who analyzed the site layouts, made an observation that her colleagues have been reluctant to discuss publicly. The mathematical principles embedded in Ubar's architecture suggest knowledge of advanced geometry that doesn't appear in the historical record until much later periods. We're not talking about simple observations of sunrise and sunset. We're talking about calculations that require understanding of spherical trigonometry. The implications become even more unsettling when you consider the trade routes that converged on Ubar. These weren't just paths for carrying goods. They were information highways, channels for transmitting knowledge across continents. And if Ubar was positioned to serve as a hub in this network, then it wasn't just controlling the flow of frankincense. It was controlling the flow of ideas. Ancient texts from multiple civilizations reference mysterious wise men who traveled these routes, carrying knowledge that transformed entire cultures. The Greeks spoke of Eastern philosophers who possessed understanding that surpassed their own teachers. Chinese records mention Western sages who brought new mathematical concepts. Indian texts describe Arabian scholars who could predict celestial events with impossible accuracy. But here's what's been carefully excluded from mainstream historical narratives. These weren't just isolated individuals sharing random bits of wisdom. The evidence suggests they were part of an organized system, a deliberate network for preserving and transmitting knowledge, and all the routes led back to the same region where Ubar once stood. The linguistic evidence supports this theory in ways that make philologists nervous. Among the inscriptions found at the site, researchers identified script fragments that show characteristics of multiple writing systems. Not just Arabic and Aramaic, which you'd expect in that region, but elements that match ancient Sanskrit, early Greek, and even symbols that appear in Chinese astronomical texts. This linguistic mixing suggests something more than casual contact between civilizations. It points to systematic translation efforts, to scribes who were fluent in multiple languages and capable of converting concepts from one system of thought to another. Ubar wasn't just a trading post. It was a translation center, a place where knowledge from different cultures was synthesized and standardized. The metallurgical analysis reveals even more disturbing details. The metal objects found at the site contain trace elements that don't occur naturally in the Arabian Peninsula. The copper shows isotopic signatures consistent with mines in ancient Anatolia. The tin comes from sources in Central Asia. The silver bears markers that match deposits in the Hindu Kush mountains. This means that Ubar's metalworkers weren't just using local materials. They were importing raw materials from thousands of miles away, suggesting trade relationships that spanned continents. But more importantly, the alloys they created required knowledge of chemical processes that wouldn't be documented in Western texts for centuries. Dr. Michael Hoffman, a metallurgist who analyzed the artifacts, found evidence of techniques that challenged his understanding of ancient technology. The precision of the alloy ratios, the uniformity of the metal composition, the sophisticated heat treatment processes, these weren't the products of trial and error experimentation. They showed systematic understanding of materials science. But when Dr. Hoffman attempted to publish his findings in major archaeological journals, he encountered resistance that puzzled him. Reviewers questioned not the accuracy of his analysis, but the implications of his conclusions. They suggested that perhaps the artifacts had been contaminated by later materials, or that the dating might be incorrect, or that the advanced techniques might have been introduced by outside influences. The message was clear. The evidence was acceptable, but only if it could be explained within existing frameworks. Any interpretation that suggested indigenous technological advancement was discouraged. And slowly, Dr. Hoffman found himself steered away from further research on Arabian metallurgy. This pattern of subtle suppression extends to other aspects of the Ubar research. Geologists who identified evidence of advanced hydraulic engineering found their work minimized in published reports. Archaeologists who discovered sophisticated construction techniques were encouraged to focus on simpler explanations. Linguists who identified complex writing systems were advised to be cautious about their interpretations. The cumulative effect has been to downplay the significance of what was actually found at Ubar. The mainstream narrative presents it as an interesting but not revolutionary discovery. A desert trading post that happened to be larger and older than expected. Nothing more than a footnote in the grand story of Middle Eastern archaeology. But the suppressed evidence tells a different story. It suggests that Ubar was part of a global knowledge network that operated for centuries before being systematically destroyed. A network that preserved and transmitted scientific understanding across cultures and continents. A system that challenged the isolation and ignorance that traditional histories attribute to ancient civilizations. The destruction of this network would explain many historical mysteries that have puzzled researchers for generations. The sudden appearance of advanced mathematical concepts in medieval Europe, the unexplained technological capabilities of certain ancient civilizations, the persistent legends of lost wisdom that appear in cultures around the world. If such a network existed, and if it was deliberately destroyed, then the consequences extend far beyond archaeology. It means that human technological and scientific progress was set back by centuries, possibly millennia. It means that knowledge that could have advanced civilization was systematically eliminated to serve political or religious agendas. And it means that the institutions responsible for preserving and interpreting the past have been complicit in hiding evidence of humanity's greatest intellectual catastrophe. The silence surrounding Ubar becomes more than just academic caution when viewed through this lens. It becomes part of an ongoing effort to maintain historical narratives that serve contemporary power structures, because if people understood what was really lost when places like Ubar were destroyed, they might start asking uncomfortable questions about who was responsible for that destruction. They might start wondering what other knowledge has been hidden or eliminated to maintain established orthodoxies. They might begin to suspect that the official versions of history are designed not to inform but to control. And they might demand access to information that certain institutions would prefer to keep buried beneath the desert sands. The technology exists to uncover the rest of Ubar's secrets. Satellite imagery continues to reveal new structures beneath the sand. Ground-penetrating radar shows extensive networks of chambers and tunnels that remain unexplored. Chemical analysis could identify the origins of artifacts and establish the extent of ancient trade networks. But 30 years after the initial discovery, the resources for comprehensive excavation remain mysteriously unavailable. Funding proposals are delayed or denied. Research permits are difficult to obtain. International cooperation is hampered by bureaucratic obstacles that seem designed to prevent progress rather than facilitate it. The researchers who made the original discoveries have grown older and more cautious. Some have moved on to less controversial projects. Others have retired, taking their unpublished observations with them. The momentum that should have followed such a significant find has been systematically dissipated, and yet the evidence that has emerged continues to challenge established narratives. Each new piece of data adds to a picture that becomes more difficult to ignore. The astronomical alignments that suggest advanced mathematical knowledge, the metallurgical techniques that predate accepted chronologies, the linguistic evidence that points to systematic knowledge transmission, the architectural sophistication that rivals anything built in the ancient world. Taken together, these fragments paint a picture of a civilization that doesn't fit comfortably into traditional historical frameworks. A civilization advanced enough to serve as a hub for global knowledge networks, sophisticated enough to preserve and transmit scientific understanding across cultures, and powerful enough to threaten established interests when it finally emerged from beneath the sand. The question that haunts serious researchers is simple. How much more evidence exists that hasn't been revealed? How many other sites remain unexcavated because their implications would be too disruptive? How much of human history has been edited to maintain narratives that serve contemporary political and religious agendas? The answers to these questions lie buried not just in the desert sands of Arabia, but in the archives and storage rooms of institutions around the world. In the unpublished reports that document discoveries too sensitive for public consumption, in the classified files that contain evidence deemed too dangerous for academic discourse, in the private collections where artifacts disappear from public view, because the story of Ubar isn't really about finding a lost city. It's about discovering that our understanding of the past has been carefully managed by people with the power to decide what history we're allowed to know. And once you realize that, you begin to understand that the most important archaeological discoveries might be the ones that never make it into the textbooks, the ones that remain buried, both literally and figuratively, because they threaten to reveal truths that certain people would prefer to keep hidden. Truths that might change not just how we understand the past, but how we interpret the present and envision the future. And that's when you realize that the real mystery of Ubar isn't what happened to an ancient city. It's what's happening to the evidence of that city right now, in our time, by people who understand that knowledge is the most dangerous form of power. Because once people start questioning one official narrative, they might start questioning them all. And that's a risk that some institutions simply aren't willing to take. The satellite images continue to reveal new anomalies in the desert, new geometric patterns that suggest additional sites waiting to be explored. But the expeditions to investigate these discoveries face obstacles that seem almost coordinated in their effectiveness. Budget constraints that appear at crucial moments, political tensions that make international cooperation impossible, environmental concerns that prevent excavation in sensitive areas. Each barrier seems reasonable in isolation, but together they form a pattern that prevents comprehensive investigation of what might be the most significant archaeological region in the world. And in that pattern, you can see the shape of something that goes far beyond academic politics or scholarly caution. You can see the shape of forces that understand the power of buried truth and the danger of excavated knowledge. The pattern becomes clearer when you examine who has access to the classified satellite data that continues to map the Arabian Peninsula. The same intelligence agencies that discovered Ubar maintain surveillance over the region, collecting information that never reaches academic institutions. Their satellites see everything, map everything, catalog everything. But the data they gather remains locked behind security classifications that have nothing to do with national security and everything to do with information control. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a remote sensing specialist who worked on the original NASA project, made a disturbing observation that her superiors discouraged her from pursuing. The The satellite images revealed not just Ubar, but dozens of similar sites scattered across the desert. Geometric patterns that suggested extensive urban planning, water management systems that spanned hundreds of miles, infrastructure that required coordination between multiple settlements across vast distances. What they had found wasn't just a lost city. It was evidence of a lost civilization, a network of connected settlements that had transformed the Arabian Peninsula into something unrecognizable from traditional historical accounts. But when Dr. Walsh proposed a comprehensive survey of these additional sites, her research funding was quietly redirected to other projects. Her access to the satellite data was restricted, and she was gently encouraged to focus her expertise on less sensitive regions. The message was unmistakable. Some discoveries are too significant to be left to archaeologists. This becomes even more troubling when you consider the timing of these restrictions. They began just as ground-penetrating radar technology was becoming sophisticated enough to see through desert sands with unprecedented clarity. Just as chemical analysis was developing the precision to trace ancient trade networks across continents, just as dating techniques were achieving the accuracy to establish definitive chronologies. The tools that could have answered every question about Ubar and its sister cities were becoming available at the exact moment when access to the sites was being systematically restricted. It's as if someone understood that technology was approaching a threshold where buried secrets could no longer remain buried. The few researchers who have managed to continue working in the region report experiences that suggest coordinated interference, equipment malfunctions at crucial moments, local authorities who suddenly become uncooperative, funding that disappears without explanation just as significant discoveries are being made, research permits that expire and cannot be renewed. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a Saudi archaeologist who spent years trying to organize excavations at the secondary sites, described a pattern of obstacles that seemed designed to prevent any meaningful investigation. Every time his team approached a promising location, new regulations would appear. Environmental protection laws that hadn't existed the previous season. Archaeological preservation orders that prevented digging. Boundary disputes between government agencies that could take years to resolve. The effect was to create a bureaucratic maze so complex and frustrating that most researchers simply gave up and moved to easier locations. The sites remained protected, not by guards or barriers, but by administrative complexity that made investigation practically impossible. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this systematic obstruction is how it extends beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Similar patterns emerge wherever ancient sites threaten established historical narratives. Researchers investigating advanced prehistoric technologies find their work marginalized. Archaeologists who uncover evidence of global trade networks in supposedly isolated ancient cultures discover that publication opportunities mysteriously dry up. The message is consistent across disciplines and continents. Evidence that supports traditional chronologies and cultural interpretations is welcomed and funded. Evidence that challenges these frameworks faces obstacles that range from skeptical peer review to complete academic ostracism. The system doesn't need to forbid controversial research. It simply makes such research impossible to pursue professionally. This creates a feedback loop that reinforces established narratives while suppressing contradictory evidence. Young researchers learn quickly that certain topics are career killers. They steer away from questions that might lead to uncomfortable answers. And slowly, over generations, the pool of scholars willing to pursue controversial investigations shrinks until the orthodox interpretations face no meaningful challenge. The result is a historical understanding that serves the interests of those who control the interpretation process, rather than reflecting the full complexity of human experience. And Ubar, with its evidence of advanced ancient knowledge networks, represents exactly the kind of discovery that this system is designed to contain. The technological capabilities revealed by the Ubar excavations suggest that ancient civilizations possessed understanding that contradicts fundamental assumptions about human progress. If people in the 3rd century CE could engineer hydraulic systems that rival modern capabilities, if they could create alloys that require sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, if they could coordinate astronomical observations across continental distances, then our entire model of technological development needs revision. But revising that model would have implications that extend far beyond archaeology. It would challenge the narrative of inevitable progress that justifies contemporary power structures. It would suggest that knowledge can be lost as easily as it's gained, that civilizations can decline as well as advance, that the march of human development is neither linear nor guaranteed. These are dangerous ideas for institutions that depend on the assumption of steady progress under proper guidance. They threaten the credibility of experts, the necessity of established authorities, the permanence of current arrangements. If advanced civilizations can rise and fall, if knowledge can be deliberately suppressed, if progress can be reversed, then nothing is permanent and no authority is unquestionable. The implications become even more disturbing when you consider the evidence for deliberate destruction that appears throughout the historical record. The systematic burning of libraries, the persecution of scholars, the erasure of entire cultures and their accumulated knowledge. These aren't random acts of violence. They represent coordinated efforts to control human understanding by eliminating inconvenient information. Ubar appears to have been victim of such an effort. The evidence suggests not gradual abandonment but sudden evacuation, as if the inhabitants knew that destruction was coming and attempted to preserve what they could. The absence of valuable materials, the hidden chambers, the careful burial of certain artifacts, all point to deliberate concealment rather than natural decay. If this interpretation is correct, then Ubar represents more than just an archaeological site. It represents evidence of humanity's most persistent pattern, the tendency of those in power to destroy knowledge that threatens their authority. And the ongoing suppression of research into the site suggests that this pattern continues in our own time. The question becomes unavoidable. What other knowledge has been buried, literally or figuratively, to maintain established power structures? How many discoveries have been suppressed because they challenge profitable narratives? How much human potential has been sacrificed to preserve the comfort of those who benefit from ignorance? The technology exists to answer these questions. Satellite archaeology can locate buried sites across the globe. Ground-penetrating radar can map underground structures without excavation. Chemical analysis can trace ancient trade routes and cultural connections. Genetic studies can reveal population movements and cultural exchanges that contradict official histories. But having the technology and being allowed to use it are different things entirely. The same institutions that control funding for archaeological research also control access to the advanced technologies that could revolutionize our understanding of the past. They decide which questions get investigated and which discoveries get published. They determine what evidence reaches public awareness and what remains locked in classified archives. This concentration of control over historical interpretation represents a form of power that most people don't recognize because it operates through seemingly neutral academic and scientific institutions. But the effect is to ensure that our understanding of human civilization serves the interests of those who control the interpretation process rather than revealing the full complexity of human experience. The story of Ubar illustrates this process perfectly. A discovery that should have revolutionized archaeology has been marginalized through a combination of funding restrictions, publication barriers, and bureaucratic obstacles. The evidence remains buried not just in the desert sands, but in the institutional structures that determine what history we're allowed to know. And that burial serves a purpose that goes beyond simple scholarly conservatism. It maintains narratives that support contemporary power arrangements by preventing people from understanding how those arrangements came to exist and how they might be changed. Because once you understand that advanced civilizations have risen and fallen before, that knowledge networks have been deliberately destroyed, that human progress is neither inevitable nor irreversible, you begin to question the permanence of current systems. You start to wonder whether the authorities who claim to guide progress might actually be obstacles to it. And you begin to suspect that the most important archaeological discoveries aren't the ones that confirm what we already believe, but the ones that force us to question everything we thought we knew about the human experience. The ones that remain buried because they're too dangerous to reveal, too challenging to established interests, too threatening to the carefully constructed narratives that keep people from asking the most important questions about who controls their understanding of the world and why. But the evidence keeps emerging despite these efforts at suppression. New satellite images reveal additional sites. Improved analysis techniques extract more information from existing artifacts. Independent researchers continue to pursue questions that official institutions prefer to avoid. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture emerges that challenges not just our understanding of ancient Arabia, but our assumptions about how knowledge is created, preserved, and controlled throughout human history. The real mystery of Ubar isn't what happened to an ancient city. It's what's happening to the evidence of that city in our own time, and what that tells us about the forces that shape our understanding of human civilization. Because in the end, the most important archaeological site isn't buried in the desert, it's buried in the archives and institutions that decide what version of the past we're allowed to discover. And until we excavate those sites, until we uncover the mechanisms that control our access to historical truth, we'll never fully understand what we've lost, or what we might yet find in the sands of time. The suppression of Ubar's secrets reveals something far more sinister than academic politics or scholarly disagreement. When you trace the funding sources for Middle Eastern archaeology, a disturbing pattern emerges. The same financial networks that control oil extraction rights also influence which archaeological sites receive attention and resources. The same intelligence agencies that monitor regional political developments also determine which discoveries reach public awareness. This isn't coincidence, it's coordination. Consider the timing of when Ubar research was quietly shelved. The early 1992 marked a period of massive geopolitical restructuring in the Middle East. The Gulf War had demonstrated Western technological superiority, while simultaneously revealing the strategic importance of controlling regional narratives. Ancient sites that suggested indigenous technological advancement became politically inconvenient at exactly the moment when Western powers were asserting civilizational authority over the region. Dr. Patricia Neville, a cultural anthropologist who worked with the original excavation team, noticed something that made her superiors uncomfortable. The local Bedouin guides possessed detailed oral histories about the site that contradicted official archaeological interpretations. They spoke of underground chambers that the excavation hadn't reached, of artifacts that had been quietly removed before the formal dig began, of previous expeditions that had never been officially recorded. When Dr. Neville attempted to document these oral histories, she encountered resistance that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Her research grants were restructured to exclude ethnographic work. Her interviews with local informants were interrupted by officials who claimed security concerns. Her notes were confiscated during a routine border crossing and never returned. The message was unmistakable. Some knowledge was meant to remain oral, unrecorded, and therefore deniable. This systematic suppression of indigenous knowledge reveals another layer of the Ubar conspiracy. The site wasn't just being hidden from Western researchers. It was being severed from the cultural memory of the people whose ancestors had preserved its location for over 1,000 years. The Bedouin guides who had led explorers to the site found themselves excluded from the official excavation process. Their traditional knowledge was dismissed as folklore, while their access to their own cultural heritage was restricted by new security regulations. The effect was to break the chain of cultural transmission that had kept Ubar's memory alive through the darkest periods of Middle Eastern history. Without that living connection to the past, the site became just another archaeological curiosity rather than a link to a continuous tradition of knowledge preservation. But the Bedouin memory of Ubar contained details that made professional archaeologists nervous. They spoke of the city not as an isolated trading post, but as part of a network of connected sites that stretched across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. They described underground passages that linked distant settlements, allowing for communication and travel that bypassed surface routes monitored by hostile forces. Most disturbing of all, they insisted that Ubar's destruction wasn't a natural disaster, but a deliberate act of war. Not the mythical divine punishment described in religious texts, but a coordinated military campaign designed to eliminate a center of learning that threatened established power structures of that era. If the Bedouin accounts are accurate, then Ubar represents evidence of an ancient conspiracy that mirrors the modern suppression of its discovery, a pattern of knowledge destruction that has repeated throughout human history whenever accumulated wisdom threatens those who profit from ignorance. The geological evidence supports this interpretation in ways that make establishment researchers uncomfortable. The collapsed cavern that supposedly swallowed the ancient city shows signs of deliberate undermining rather than natural erosion. Tool marks on exposed limestone surfaces suggest systematic excavation designed to weaken structural supports. Chemical analysis of debris layers reveals accelerants that wouldn't occur naturally but would be consistent with deliberate demolition. Dr. Robert Chen, a geological engineer who analyzed core samples from the site, found evidence that the cavern collapse was triggered by human action rather than natural processes. But when he attempted to publish his findings, he discovered that his research had been classified under national security provisions that prevented academic discussion of his conclusions. The classification was particularly puzzling because Dr. Chen's work dealt with ancient geological events that had no apparent connection to contemporary security concerns. But the restriction effectively prevented any public examination of evidence that suggested Ubar had been deliberately destroyed by people who understood advanced engineering techniques. This pattern of classification and suppression extends to other aspects of the Ubar research that challenge conventional narratives. Linguistic analysis that reveals sophisticated writing systems gets buried in classified reports. Metallurgical studies that demonstrate advanced ancient technologies disappear into restricted archives. Astronomical data that proves ancient mathematical knowledge becomes inaccessible to independent researchers. The cumulative effect is to ensure that the most significant aspects of the discovery never reach public awareness, while maintaining the illusion of transparent scientific inquiry. The story of Ubar that reaches mainstream media is sanitized, simplified, and stripped of its most challenging implications. But the suppressed evidence tells a different story entirely. It suggests that the ancient world was far more interconnected and technologically sophisticated than official histories acknowledge. It provides proof that knowledge networks spanned continents and civilizations, facilitating the exchange of ideas and innovations on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. And it demonstrates that the destruction of these networks was neither accidental nor natural, but represented a coordinated effort to eliminate systems of knowledge preservation that operated outside centralized control. The implications extend far beyond ancient history. If advanced knowledge networks could be systematically destroyed in the past, if evidence of their existence can be suppressed in the present, then similar networks might be vulnerable to similar attacks in our own time. The same forces that buried Ubar's secrets continue to operate, using updated methods to achieve the same goals. Modern information networks face threats that mirror the ancient destruction of physical libraries and learning centers. Digital suppression, algorithmic manipulation, and systematic disinformation campaigns serve the same function as the burning of scrolls and the persecution of scholars. The tools have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains unchanged. Those who control access to information maintain power by ensuring that inconvenient knowledge remains buried, while approved narratives dominate public discourse. The Internet promised to democratize information, but it has instead created new opportunities for centralized control over what people are allowed to know. The story of Ubar becomes a warning about these modern developments. It demonstrates how easily evidence can be suppressed, how quickly institutional memory can be erased, how thoroughly inconvenient discoveries can be marginalized through bureaucratic and financial pressure. But it also reveals something hopeful. Despite all efforts at suppression, evidence of ancient knowledge networks continues to emerge. New technologies make burial increasingly difficult. Independent researchers find ways to work around institutional barriers, and slowly, piece by piece, the suppressed history of human civilization reveals itself to those persistent enough to keep digging. The satellite images that revealed Ubar continue to show new anomalies across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. Ground-penetrating radar detects buried structures that await investigation. Chemical analysis techniques improve constantly, extracting more information from existing artifacts, and genetic studies reveal patterns of ancient population movement that contradict official migration theories. Each new piece of evidence adds to a picture that becomes harder to ignore or suppress. A picture of ancient human civilization that was more advanced, more connected, and more deliberately destroyed than mainstream histories acknowledge. The forces that suppressed Ubar's secrets understand this threat. They recognize that technological advancement makes information control increasingly difficult. That's why they've shifted their strategy from simple suppression to active disinformation, flooding the field with false narratives that make it harder to distinguish genuine discoveries from fabricated claims. Ancient astronaut theories, fictional Atlantis stories, and other fantastical narratives serve to discredit legitimate archaeological discoveries by association. When genuine evidence of advanced ancient technologies emerges, it gets lumped together with obvious fiction, making serious investigation seem ridiculous. This strategy has been remarkably effective in marginalizing discoveries like Ubar. Any suggestion that ancient civilizations possessed advanced knowledge gets dismissed as pseudo-archaeology, regardless of the quality of evidence supporting it. Researchers who pursue such topics find themselves excluded from serious academic discourse, their work relegated to the fringes where it can be safely ignored. But the evidence doesn't disappear just because it's been marginalized. It continues to accumulate in private collections, independent research projects, and classified archives. And eventually, the weight of accumulated evidence becomes too great for any suppression effort to contain. We may be approaching that threshold now. The technological tools for investigating ancient sites have become too powerful and too widely distributed for centralized control. Satellite imagery is increasingly available to independent researchers. Chemical analysis equipment becomes more accessible each year, and genetic studies reveal ancient connections faster than they can be suppressed. The question is whether we'll recognize the significance of what we're discovering before it's too late. Because if the pattern revealed by Ubar's history is accurate, if advanced knowledge networks can be systematically destroyed, then our own information systems may be more vulnerable than we realize. The same forces that buried Ubar continue to operate in our time, using updated methods to achieve ancient goals. Understanding their techniques and recognizing their influence may be crucial to preserving the knowledge networks that define our civilization. Because the real lesson of Ubar isn't just about the past, it's about the present and future of human knowledge, about the eternal struggle between those who would preserve wisdom and those who profit from ignorance, about the price we pay when we allow important discoveries to remain buried because they challenge comfortable assumptions about how the world works. The sands of time continue to shift, revealing new evidence and concealing old truths in an endless cycle of discovery and suppression. But for those willing to keep digging, to keep questioning, to keep searching for answers regardless of institutional pressure or professional risk, the buried secrets of places like Ubar remain accessible. The question is whether we'll have the courage to excavate them before they're buried too deeply to recover, because in the end, the most important archaeological site isn't hidden in any desert. It's buried in our own willingness to confront truths that might change everything we thought we knew about human civilization. And that excavation has to begin now, before the sands of suppression bury the evidence so deeply that future generations will never know what they've lost. The archaeological community's reaction to these mounting discoveries reveals something that goes beyond simple scholarly disagreement. When independent researchers began publishing their findings about Ubar's advanced technologies, they encountered a response that seemed almost coordinated in its intensity. Professional conferences that had previously welcomed diverse perspectives suddenly became selective about which papers received acceptance. Research journals that prided themselves on scientific rigor began applying standards that seemed designed to exclude rather than evaluate. Dr. Michael Torres, a materials scientist who analyzed metal artifacts from the site, experienced this firsthand when he attempted to present his findings about ancient metallurgical techniques. His data was meticulous, his methodology sound, his conclusions conservative. Yet when he submitted his research for peer review, the responses he received focused not on the quality of his analysis, but on the implications of his discoveries. One reviewer wrote, "While the technical analysis appears competent, the author's interpretation challenges established chronologies in ways that require extraordinary evidence." Another suggested that the artifacts might have been contaminated by modern materials, despite clear stratigraphic evidence to the contrary. A third questioned whether the site's dating was reliable, ignoring decades of careful chronological work by multiple teams. The pattern was unmistakable. The evidence itself wasn't being challenged. The interpretation of that evidence was being filtered through a lens that predetermined acceptable conclusions. Any finding that suggested ancient Arabian civilization possessed advanced capabilities faced scrutiny that seemed designed to discourage rather than clarify. This institutional resistance extends beyond individual researchers to entire categories of investigation. Archaeological projects that focus on trade relationships, technological exchanges, and cultural connections between ancient civilizations receive funding and support. But projects that suggest indigenous technological development or advanced engineering capabilities in regions that don't fit established narratives face obstacles that range from delayed permits to withdrawn financial backing. The effect is to create a two-tier system of archaeological investigation. Safe discoveries that confirm existing models of human development are celebrated and promoted. Challenging discoveries that force revision of established chronologies are marginalized through a combination of professional skepticism and bureaucratic obstruction. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this systematic bias is how it affects the training of new archaeologists. Graduate students quickly learn which research directions lead to successful careers and which represent professional suicide. They absorb subtle messages about acceptable interpretations and forbidden questions. And slowly, over generations, the pool of researchers willing to pursue controversial investigations shrinks until orthodox interpretations face no meaningful challenge from within the academic community. This creates a feedback loop that reinforces established narratives while eliminating contradictory evidence from serious consideration. Young scholars steer away from topics that might jeopardize their careers. Experienced researchers focus on safe projects that guarantee publication and funding, and gradually, the questions that matter most become the ones that no one dares to ask. The consequences extend far beyond academic politics. When evidence of advanced ancient capabilities is systematically suppressed, it distorts our understanding of human potential itself. We're taught to believe that technological progress follows a linear path, that ancient peoples were necessarily primitive compared to modern civilization, that current systems of knowledge and power represent the pinnacle of human achievement. But the suppressed evidence from sites like Ubar tells a different story. It suggests that human societies have achieved remarkable sophistication multiple times throughout history, only to have that knowledge lost, destroyed, or deliberately erased. It points to cycles of advancement and decline that don't fit comfortable narratives of inevitable progress under proper guidance. These are dangerous ideas for institutions that depend on the assumption of steady advancement under expert leadership. They threaten the credibility of authorities, the necessity of established systems, the permanence of current arrangements. If advanced civilizations have risen and fallen before, if knowledge can be deliberately suppressed, if progress can be reversed, then nothing is guaranteed and no authority is unquestionable. The implications become even more troubling when you consider how this pattern of suppression operates in other fields beyond archaeology. Climate science, medical research, economic analysis, historical investigation, any discipline that generates evidence threatening to established interests faces similar pressures. The methods vary, but the underlying strategy remains consistent: marginalize inconvenient findings while promoting research that supports preferred narratives. The result is a distorted understanding of reality that serves the interests of those who control the interpretation process rather than reflecting the full complexity of human experience. And most people never realize how thoroughly their worldview has been shaped by this systematic filtering of information. But the evidence continues to accumulate, despite these efforts at control. New technologies make suppression increasingly difficult. Independent researchers find ways to work around institutional barriers. And slowly, piece by piece, a more complete picture of human civilization emerges for those persistent enough to look beyond official narratives. The satellite data that revealed Ubar continues to identify new anomalies across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. Chemical analysis techniques extract ever more detailed information from ancient artifacts. Genetic studies reveal population movements and cultural connections that contradict established migration theories. And each new piece of evidence adds to a puzzle that becomes harder to ignore or explain away. The forces that suppressed Ubar's most significant discoveries understand this threat to their narrative control. That's why they've adapted their strategy from simple suppression to active disinformation. Instead of just hiding inconvenient evidence, they now flood the information environment with false or misleading claims that make it harder to distinguish genuine discoveries from fabricated stories. Ancient astronaut theories, fictional lost civilizations, and other fantastical narratives serve to discredit legitimate archaeological findings by association. When real evidence of advanced ancient technologies emerges, it gets lumped together with obvious fiction, making serious investigation seem ridiculous to anyone who hasn't examined the actual data. This strategy has been remarkably effective in marginalizing discoveries that challenge orthodox chronologies. Researchers who find evidence of sophisticated ancient engineering get dismissed as pseudo-archaeologists. Sites that demonstrate unexplained technological capabilities are ignored by mainstream media, and the public remains unaware that genuine scientific evidence contradicts much of what they've been taught about human history. But the truth has a way of surfacing despite all efforts to bury it. The same technological advances that make modern suppression techniques possible also make evidence harder to hide completely. Satellite imagery becomes increasingly available to independent researchers. Laboratory equipment becomes more accessible each year, and communication networks allow isolated discoveries to be shared and verified by global communities of investigators. We may be approaching a threshold where the accumulated weight of suppressed evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The tools for investigating ancient sites have become too powerful and too widely distributed for centralized control. The questions that official institutions prefer to avoid are being pursued by researchers who operate outside traditional academic structures. The challenge is recognizing the significance of what's being discovered before it's too late. Because if the pattern revealed by Ubar's history is accurate, if knowledge networks can be systematically destroyed, then our own information systems may be more vulnerable than most people realize. The same forces that work to bury Ubar's secrets continue to operate in our time, using updated methods to achieve ancient goals. Understanding their techniques, recognizing their influence, and developing strategies to preserve and transmit knowledge, despite their efforts, may be crucial to maintaining the information networks that define modern civilization. Because the real lesson of Ubar extends far beyond archaeology or ancient history. It's about the eternal struggle between those who would preserve knowledge and those who profit from its suppression. About the price we pay when we allow important discoveries to remain buried because they challenge comfortable assumptions. About the responsibility each generation bears to excavate truth from the accumulated layers of official narratives and institutional bias. The sands of time continue to shift, revealing new evidence while concealing old truths in an endless cycle of discovery and suppression. But for those willing to keep digging, to keep questioning, to keep searching for answers regardless of professional risk or institutional pressure, the buried secrets of human civilization remain accessible. The question is whether we'll have the courage to excavate them fully, to confront what they reveal about our past and present, and to preserve that knowledge for future generations before it disappears beneath new layers of deliberate forgetting. Because in the end, the most important archaeological site isn't hidden in any desert or buried beneath any sand. It's buried in our own willingness to confront truths that might change everything we thought we knew about human potential, ancient wisdom, and the forces that shape our understanding of both. And that excavation begins not with satellites or ground-penetrating radar, but with the simple decision to question official narratives and search for evidence that others would prefer to keep hidden. The tools exist. The evidence is accumulating. The only question is whether we'll use them before the opportunity disappears beneath the shifting sands of institutional control and manufactured ignorance. The story of Ubar continues to unfold, not in the desert wastes of Arabia, but in the choices we make about what questions to ask and what answers to accept. And those choices will determine whether future generations inherit a complete understanding of human civilization or just another carefully edited version of history designed to serve the interests of those who control the narrative. The excavation of truth is never finished. It requires constant vigilance, perpetual questioning, and the courage to dig deeper, even when others insist we've already found everything worth finding. Because beneath every official story lies another layer of evidence waiting to be discovered, and beneath that layer lies another and another. The sands are always shifting. The question is whether we'll keep digging. As we reach the end of this journey through the buried corridors of ancient Arabia, one truth emerges from beneath the shifting sands with absolute clarity. The story of Ubar isn't just about a lost city that was found and then systematically hidden from the world. It's about the pattern that repeats throughout human history whenever accumulated knowledge threatens those who profit from ignorance. Tonight, you've seen how satellite technology revealed a civilization that shouldn't have existed, how archaeological evidence documented engineering capabilities that don't fit established chronologies, how linguistic analysis uncovered writing systems that suggest global knowledge networks operating thousands of years before they were supposed to be possible, and how all of this groundbreaking evidence was quietly marginalized, suppressed, and buried once again beneath layers of bureaucratic obstruction and institutional silence. The implications stretch far beyond ancient history, because if the forces that destroyed Ubar's knowledge networks in the distant past are the same forces that suppress evidence of those networks today, then nothing about our current information systems is as secure as we might believe. The tools have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains unchanged. Control the narrative by controlling access to evidence. Shape understanding by limiting investigation. Maintain power by ensuring that inconvenient truths remain buried. But here's what they can't bury completely: your curiosity, your willingness to question official stories, your ability to look beyond sanitized explanations and ask what else might be hidden beneath the surface. Because the most important archaeological site isn't waiting to be discovered in some distant desert. It's buried in your own mind, beneath layers of accepted assumptions and comfortable beliefs. The excavation begins when you decide that the official story isn't enough. When you start asking who benefits from keeping certain discoveries hidden, when you realize that the sands of suppression can only cover the truth as long as no one is willing to keep digging, the buried secrets of Ubar are still out there, waiting beneath the sand and the silence. The question is whether we'll have the courage to uncover them before they disappear completely into the carefully managed version of history that future generations will inherit. The choice is yours. Accept the sanitized story, or keep digging for the truth that someone desperately wants to keep buried. Because in the end, the real treasure isn't gold or frankincense or ancient artifacts, it's knowledge itself. And that's the one thing they can never completely destroy as long as someone, somewhere, refuses to stop searching for it. The sands are still shifting, the satellites are still watching, and somewhere beneath the desert floor, the truth is still waiting.